went down as Donald Trump had signed this executive order in the Oval Office and again had some choice words for dealing with Canada.
We don't need cars from Canada. We don't need energy from Canada. We don't need anything from Canada.
The U.S. Okay, it may
go to the extent of cutting off their energy, going down to Michigan, going down to New York State, and over to Wisconsin.
Okay, it may now be a little harder for you to get international packages shipped to the U.S. Now, multiple postal services across Europe, including Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Italy, have stopped shipping most merchandise to the U.S.
7 countries, 7 markets that once stood firmly behind American products have turned their backs in the span of a single year. What began as quiet speculation in trade circles has erupted into a seismic shift in global commerce, a moment many are calling the first real crack in America's dominance since the Cold War. From Brazil to Japan, from Europe to the Gulf, buyers are rewriting contracts and rethinking loyalties. Goods that once carried the prestige of Made in America are now burdened with a new reputation. Unreliable, unsafe, unsustainable that U.S. corporations scramble to explain shipping delays, rising costs, and compliance failures. Canada has quietly stepped into the gap with steady, dependable offerings. This transformation isn't just about export numbers or quarterly losses. It cuts to something deeper. It's about cultural influence, consumer trust, and the very meaning of America's place in the world. If global markets can no longer rely on American goods, what does that suggest about America's ability to lead beyond trade? Nowhere is this change more visible than in Brazil. On the surface, supermarket shelves tell a simple story. American snacks like Pringles and Oreos have slipped from prime display aisles. But beneath those small adjustments lies a much larger shift. Canadian brands now command 43% more shelf space than they did just a quarter earlier, while U.S. household names lose ground. The financial fallout has been swift. Kellogg's, once a staple across Latin America's biggest consumer market, saw Brazilian revenues plunge 16% in a single year. For shoppers, the choice is straightforward. Canadian products are viewed as more transparent in origin, more consistent in quality, and more aligned with modern consumer expectations. What looks like a change in taste is, in reality, a reordering of trust. If the United States can lose Brazil, the heart of Latin American consumption, what chance does it have of holding the rest of the region? Australia offers another warning sign, though this time the erosion extends beyond commerce to culture. For decades, American denim and casual were defined the style of young people in Sydney and Melbourne. Today, that influence has faded. Canadian apparel brands have surged, with sales up 28% across major cities, while U.S. clothing lines have dropped 15%. The complaints from retailers sound familiar. Slow deliveries, rigid contracts, and a lack of flexibility to meet shifting trends. By contrast, Canadian companies are seen as nimble, responsive, and culturally aware. What began as a trade recalibration has turned into something larger, a cultural realignment where consumers are choosing brands that feel closer to their values. For a market as distant as Australia to pivot so decisively, the implications are unmistakable. America's soft power advantage in lifestyle and culture can no longer be taken for granted. The stakes rise even further in Asia and the Middle East, where consumption growth is driving the future of global trade. In India, long considered an expanding opportunity for U.S. food exporters, imports of processed American goods have fallen 17% in just 5 months. Canadian suppliers quickly filled the gap, boosting their export by 31% and embedding themselves as everyday staples for the rising middle class. What may look like a trade statistic is, in fact, the foundation of a new reality. Each lost contract, each vanishing product line, represents more than a short-term loss. It signals the unraveling of trust that once set the United States apart. From supermarket shelves in Brazil to fashion racks in Australia and kitchen cupboards in India, the pattern is clear. America's dominance in both trade and culture is no longer assured. And as Canada positions itself as a steady alternative, the world is quietly redrawing its sense of who it trusts, who it buys from, and ultimately, who it follows. Across the Gulf, the transformation has been just as striking. Stricter halal standards in the UAE sidelined major American brands and opened the door for Canadian companies. Jameson Vitamins, for example, recorded a 42% surge in sales. This was more than a shift in market share. It reflected a deeper change in values, where compliance and cultural sensitivity mattered as much as affordability. Even in Japan, a country long entwined with U.S. trade, the cracks are widening. Canadian goods climbed 17% in the first half of 2025, while American imports stumbled amid delivery delays and mislabeling scandals. For a society that prizes reliability and precision, the verdict was swift. Trust, once firmly in Washington's hands, is shifting northward. Taken together, India, the Gulf, and Japan now represent some of the fastest-growing consumer markets in the world. And the most telling detail is that the United States was not forced out. It withdrew by its own missteps that if Asia and the Middle East revealed America's inability to adapt, Europe delivered the harshest blow, not through politics or protectionism, but through regulation. In markets where compliance is everything, U.S. goods are increasingly locked out by the very standards that define modern trade. In France, Canadian household products surged 26%, while American imports fell 18%. The shift was not about consumer whims, but about adaptability. Canadian firms quickly aligned with EU sustainability and labeling requirements, while American companies lagged, mired in outdated practices. Germany sharpened the critique further. A widely circulated report flagged the presence of certain chemicals in U.S. consumer goods, sparking a 33% rise in Canadian imports of groceries and personal care items. The contrast was stark. American brands appeared careless and rigid, while Canadian suppliers won credibility by respecting Europe's exacting standards. The larger danger for Washington lies in the ripple effect. European rules rarely stay confined to Europe. They often become global benchmarks, influencing trade policy from Latin America to Asia. As Brussels tightens standards and Canadian firms adapt with ease, the U.S. risks finding itself sidelined in a system it once helped shape. Together, these setbacks point to a single conclusion: no one stole America's dominance. America surrendered it. The unraveling was not orchestrated by strategic rivals or dictated by foreign governments, but stemmed from the miscalculations of American corporations themselves. For decades, a contract with a U.S. firm was seen as a guarantee of stability. Today, those same agreements look rigid and outdated, locking buyers into terms that fail to reflect shifting consumer demands or evolving regulatory landscapes. Delivery times once considered acceptable now lag behind leaner, more responsive competitors. Sudden price hikes, increasingly common, have further undermined trust precisely as buyers struggle to contain rising costs. What once felt like dependable partnership now looks like inflexibility. Beyond operational failures, a reputational crisis is taking root. From food to fashion to electronics, American goods often fail to meet the higher health, safety, and environmental standards that dominate global trade in the 21st century. Where competitors innovate with cleaner inputs and transparent processes, U.S. firms cling to legacy systems. To buyers, this signals not just inefficiency but a deeper arrogance, the sense that American companies expect others to adjust rather than adapting themselves. This perception has become as damaging as any misdelivery. The corporations once celebrated for pioneering technology and trusted branding now carry the image of institutions resistant to change. Instead of symbols of quality and reliability, Made in America increasingly conveys rigidity and imposition. The fallout has not been loud or sudden, but steady and profound. In markets from the Gulf to Europe, from Asia to Latin America, the world is rethinking what it means to trust an American product. And in that quiet recalibration, America's once unshakable grip on global trade and culture is slipping away. There were no street protests, no fiery speeches, no dramatic boycotts. The rejection unfolded quietly, one consumer decision at a time. Shelves were rearranged in supermarkets, contracts were discreetly rewritten, and buyers began to explore other options. What looked like a boycott was not a coordinated political act, but a market verdict. It was a collective shrug from foreign consumers who concluded they had better choices elsewhere. And as that verdict rippled across continents, the United States discovered an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous form of decline is not open confrontation, but creeping irrelevance. In Japan, punctuality became a decisive edge. Canadian exporters revised contracts to guarantee delivery windows that aligned with the country's famously precise logistics culture. Individually, these adaptations might seem minor, but together they created something larger, a cumulative reputation. Canada was increasingly seen as a partner that listens, adapts, and delivers. Over time, this reputation spread across 7 key markets: Brazil, Australia, India, the UAE, Japan, France, and Germany. And crucially, Canada was not merely filling gaps left by the U.S. It was reshaping the very idea of what trade partnerships should be. Canadian goods were not portrayed as stopgap substitutes, but as cleaner, safer, and more dependable alternatives. The national brand identity that emerged combined competence with humility, an image that resonated powerfully in an era when trust had become the ultimate currency. Ottawa also understood something Washington seemed to miss: the symbolism of trade policy. Where the United States wielded tariffs like blunt weapons, Canada used frictions as opportunities to demonstrate reliability. Regulatory hurdles, price pressures, and geopolitical turbulence were framed not as threats, but as chances to prove adaptability. Buyers noticed. What started as temporary adjustments gradually turned into permanent footholds. Canadian exporters, once considered secondary, began to evolve into first-choice partners for multinational firms. For the first time in decades, Canada was no longer defined in contrast to its larger neighbor. It was building a trade identity on its own terms, rooted in cooperation rather than confrontation. The implication for the United States was stark. If this trajectory holds, America risks losing more than market share. It could forfeit its very role as a global leader. The economic costs are already measurable. Analysts warn that tariffs alone could shave 0.3 percentage points off U.S. GDP, translating into more than 400,000 lost jobs. Those numbers are not abstractions. They mean shuttered factories, reduced paychecks, and communities stripped of stability. Meanwhile, Canada, once dismissed as too small to compete at scale, has absorbed the same shocks while gaining something far more valuable: international trust. In market after market, where U.S. firms faltered, Canadian companies presented themselves not simply as alternatives, but as preferred partners. That shift has produced an outcome unthinkable a generation ago. New trade agreements are being signed with Canada at the table, while Washington is conspicuously absent. The country that once wrote the rules of global commerce now risks standing outside the room as others decide the terms. The deeper question is whether the United States will recognize that its real adversary is not Canada, but its own inflexibility. Will Washington adapt before the erosion becomes permanent, or will it continue to double down on outdated practices and heavy-handed strategies? The world is no longer waiting for an answer. From Europe to Asia to Latin America, the markets have already rendered their judgment. Whether America's decline proves temporary